Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Vikings, Season 4, Episode 20, The Reckoning. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Vikings, so I have to start with a spoiler warning for Vikings up to Season 4, Episode 20. If you haven't seen up to the Season 4 finale, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you. So this final episode wasn't quite as great as I was expecting, mainly because I think my expectations were too high. But that was based on how great this half season has been so far. I was kind of expecting this episode to be a huge climax and its crowning achievement, which they have done in the past for like Season 2 and a little bit for Season 3, but it didn't quite live up to that. In fact, it seemed like a rather arbitrary place to end the season, as there were many other episodes in this season that could have also served just as equally as a season ender, Ragnar's death included. In fact, I'm really just overall perplexed by this new format of doing half seasons of 10 episodes each, which really should be considered their own separate seasons, as there was a huge break in between the halves, and each half is totally different from the other, but whatever, I have to move past that. But don't get me wrong, I am not saying that this was a bad episode in any way, shape, or form. It was, in fact, a very good one. There were a lot of things about this episode I loved. I just wouldn't call it the best of the season, which is what I was hoping for. But again, that's my own fault for having my expectations too high. So the start of this episode was absolutely amazing, and at the risk of treading into hyperbole, I dare say these were some of the best battle sequences of the show thus far. Last week I said I was a bit sick of Aethelwulf being portrayed as a useless incompetent, and that I'd hoped that they actually showed his worth. And even though he lost the battle horribly, I do believe that they did that, because Aethelwulf himself was a total badass in this battle. He really kicked ass and did a lot of really stunning badass moves, and he was smart enough to recognize when they lost and when it was time to get the hell out. And I'm really happy that the show kept this character alive. I was a bit worried about him for a moment. It was also interesting that the Vikings let them retreat, as they simply were cheering as the Saxons were retreating rather than like shooting arrows at them and continuing to kill them. I suppose it goes to show the Saxons' portrayal of them as savages isn't completely accurate, as they do have a sense of honor in battle, different as it may be. So from the very first shot of the episode, we saw Egbert acting like someone who lost his mind, just rocking back and forth, and I knew he was going to die. So it made sense when he refused to leave with Aethelwulf and the others, and it was interesting seeing Aethelwulf being crowned king, and also a little touching seeing him say goodbye to his loved ones. Now, in the preview for this episode, they showed the scene where the Vikings rolled into Wessex with no one there to oppose them, and Bjorn was worried it was a trap. I kind of was hoping that it was, and perhaps it was in a sense, but not in the way I thought. Instead, the Saxons truly have vacated in order to regroup and re-strengthen their forces, which indeed was a smart move, and I'm sure a difficult one that required some pride swallowing. So again, I'm glad to see another example of Aethelwulf being competent and intelligent. So it was strange seeing the Vikings burn some of the books and ledges and timeless pieces of art, as what you have to remember is in this time period these are unique and one of the kind pieces. For the most part, there are no copies. And to be clear, I'm not surprised that the Vikings would burn them, as that's totally within their character and I'm sure totally in keeping with history. But I am surprised that the Saxons would leave them behind, as at the very least I think Egbert would ensure them being taken away, as they were always very important to him. But I'm sure they were more concerned with getting the fuck out of there as soon as possible, so it does make sense, but I'm still a bit disappointed. Speaking of disappointed, I wasn't very happy with the death of Helga. I was hoping the storyline with her adopting and being obsessed with this young Muslim girl would bear fruit, but this isn't what I was expecting, and I don't ultimately think it really justifies the storyline, as it seems the whole point was to lead to Helga's death. I suppose it does make some sort of poetic sense that her obsession with having a child born out of grief of the loss of her children in the past past would drive her a bit mad and lead to her death, I'm just totally not convinced by this young girl's murder-suicide decision, and I was ultimately hoping for a better outcome to the storyline. Thus, I'm sure story-wise, it will has a purpose as a catalyst for Floki to go off and do his own thing. Plus, it does seem like this season is set on killing off the older generation and focusing more on the newer one. Has not only Helga, but we also got the death of Ekberg in this episode. So it seems Floki and Lagertha are the only two remaining from the older generation that started the show, and Floki's future on the show seems a bit uncertain at the end of this episode, and Lagertha's demise was foreshadowed previously, so we'll see how this goes. So it does seem to me that the deed Ekberg signed to the Vikings, which he claimed was a legal claim to their land, isn't as legal as all that, because he is no longer king, as he made a point of making Aethelwulf king and renouncing his crown officially. Yet he kept telling the Vikings that he was king, which was an out-and-out lie. So it seems like this was the one final trick, the one last scheme that he had in him. Although I'm not sure how big of a difference it will ultimately make, as it just means that the other Saxons won't recognize their claim to this land, which they probably wouldn't anyway, decreed or no. But I don't know, maybe it will make a difference. We'll see. And maybe the land he gave them was purposely treacherous and dangerous for them. So again, we'll see. So I liked Ekberg's death. It was a good death for this character, and interesting that he bargained for an easy death and didn't have to suffer through a blood eagle, which looks like one of the most painful ways to die ever. And that's totally in keeping for his character to go out scheming, so a great way for that character to go. Although I did kind of feel like the show was trying to get me as emotional about Ekberg's death as I was with Ragnar's, with all the flashback dialogues and heavy music. Seems like they were laying it on a little bit thick, as I did think it was a good death, but I don't care about Ekberg nearly as much as I care about Ragnar, so it might have been a tad bit too much. So then we get the episode big shocking ending, which was actually spoiled for me, as apparently this episode leaked a week ago and I had the misfortune of watching a YouTube video that showed a clip of this. So I was really bummed out about that, and I am referring specifically to Ivar killing Sigurd, which was quite surprising, mainly because I know the show likes to keep in touch with history as much as possible, and as far as I know, this goes against history. Although a lot of the historical accounts from this time period are vague, so the show often takes liberties to fill in the gaps. But this one seems like a bit too radical, to me. But it was a really cool scene nonetheless. I am interested in how Ivar will reconcile with his two other full brothers, as according to history they do work together on the conquest of England. But it was, just going by the show, it would make sense that they would execute Ivar for murdering his own brother, but knowing a bit of history, I know that's not going to happen, so it will be interesting to see how the show handles this. Also, I feel the need to point out how easily Helga and Sigurd died. I mean, they both were stabbed just like below the shoulder, whereas Arya Stark would have easily survived that. She would have brushed that off like, oh, it's just a scratch. I guess it's a shame that Helga and Sigurd didn't know any actress who could stitch them up, because she learned that from stitching up old boyfriends. And to be clear, for those who may not detect sarcasm or don't watch Game of Thrones, I actually can commend Vikings for being more realistic with their deaths, and that statement was more of a jab at Game of Thrones. Anyway, it does seem Bjorn and a large portion of the Great Army are leaving to either return to Norway or on their quest to the Mediterranean, which will leave the forces that remain in England a bit at a disadvantage, perhaps more than they realize, as while the Saxons regroup and rebuild their forces, the Vikings' forces will be really diminished. And perhaps this is part of the reason Ekberg stayed behind to be killed, because he knew that his death and Alar's death was their true purpose of seeking revenge for Ragnar's death would be satisfied, and thus the great Viking army would lose a lot of steam and would splinter. So that being the case, that does bring a sense of irony and symmetry that both Ragnar and Eckbark chose their death for strategic purposes, and their deaths are part of a larger strategy, which is quite interesting indeed. So then the episode ends with the introduction of a new character, this warrior bishop who likes to bang widows, and for the most part I found this scene totally unnecessary to this episode. And I think this scene would have worked much better as like the first scene of season 5 rather than the last scene of season 4. It seems to me that the show acquired this actor who's apparently fairly well known as being one of the stars of the show Tudors, and they wanted to show him off this season to get people excited for next season, but I don't think it really fits, and they should have just saved it for season 5, but that's just me. So my rating for The Reckoning out of 10 is an 8, extremely good. This was a good episode with some amazing battle sequences. It was great seeing Aethelwulf stand up as a leader, even in defeat. It was great seeing Eckbark go out the way he lived as a schemer, and it was great seeing how divided Ragnar's sons became once they achieved the revenge that they sought. But this episode was a bit more slow-paced setup episode than I was expecting for the finale, and some things didn't sit right with me, such as Helga's death, but overall, it was still a really good episode. So that's it for my review of The Reckoning, and I am very pleased to announce that this won't be the end of my Vikings Season 4 coverage, as in a couple of days I will be doing a live discussion video with Phil, the Issues Guy. For those of you who aren't even familiar with my previous collaborations with Phil, you may recognize Phil the Issues Guy as one of the few other YouTubers that covers Vikings, so I'm very pleased to get a chance to discuss Season 4 of Vikings with him. It should be a lot of fun, so make sure to join us live in the chat, which will be this Saturday night, the 4th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the US, which will be Sunday afternoon at 1 p.m. for me here in New Zealand. So make sure to join us for some interesting discussions about all of Season 4 of Vikings. Also be sure to check out my channel for many other videos on other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Black Sails, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.